Please welcome J Street's Vice President of Communications, Logan Bayroff.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with my panelists. Leah Greenberg on my left is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Indivisible Project, one of the largest grassroots progressive organizations in the country that does amazing work. And on my right, someone who perhaps needs no introduction, Ruth Messenger. You've had a legendary career in the Jewish community and New York politics as a leading advocate for social and racial justice. So, we've been discussing how this has been obviously a critical election cycle for American democracy. And of course, as we've discussed, 2022 saw a massive amount of mobilization from Jewish Americans, including pro-Israel groups and PACs, on behalf of candidates who vowed to defend our democratic freedoms and values. And we've spoken about all that J Street PAC did. We had our J Street Action Fund working in Democratic primaries to support pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy candidates. So we did a great deal this cycle. And yet, I think in terms of overall spending and in terms of controversy, probably the most talked about intervention in this election cycle came from AIPAC. While their new federal PAC endorsed 109 of the Republican candidates who voted to overturn the results of the presidential election on January 6th, their new super PAC, the ironically named United Democracy Project, spent nearly $30 million exclusively to target progressive Democratic candidates in the primaries and later in the general election when they spent about $1 million targeting Democrat Summer Lee right before the general election in November. So, Leah, I want to start with you. What do you think the goal of this political intervention by AIPAC and its backers was? How successful do you think it was? And as a progressive leader working with candidates and activists across the country, how did you see its impact in this cycle? And how did you see progressives and liberals working together to push back?
Thanks, Logan. It's great to be here with you all. I would say that the goal was twofold. First was to shape this incoming class of Democratic congresspeople, right, to get them to be more aligned with AIPAC's policy positions, and also to have a longer-term deterrent effect on future folks who might think about running for office and how outspoken they are going to be on this issue, what positions they're going to take, raising the risks that as they are involved, there is going to be this, a significant infusion of cash spent against them. And I would note this was part of a broader trend. Several different major actors who are not invested, I should note, in the health of the Democratic Party or in the future of Democratic majorities were very involved in spending enormous amounts of money in Democratic primaries this cycle. It wasn't just AIPAC, it was also crypto. It was also a set of corporate and Silicon Valley interests who put sums of money that are just unprecedented in Democratic primaries in. And what we saw was, as one of a number of folks who have partnered with J Street and with other folks involved in primaries and along with our local Indivisible groups who support these candidates on the ground, was that there was sort of a ratio, right, where if you could, we expect to get outspent, but if you could keep it to 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, you had a really good chance of winning. Once you get to 5-to-1, some of the sums of money that we were seeing in this cycle were just sort of difficult to overcome with folks like Nita Alam or Donna Edwards. Now, I should also add, when we talk about the goals of this originally, in spite of the name United Democracy Project, the goal was not to promote democracy or to promote a Democratic majority. And those two things are inherently linked in a period of time when the Republican Party is dominated by election deniers. So what we saw was, again, all of these folks, both AIPAC and then crypto and all these other folks, they were investing heavily to shape this incoming class, but they were not actually showing up to defend a Democratic majority. And as an organization that we get involved in primaries, but we're 100% clear that when the primary is over, you get behind the general election candidate because that is how you protect our democracy. That was not what we saw on the other side. When we saw them throwing in against Summer Lee in the general election, that was in a moment when the House was incredibly close and every seat mattered. That was money spent to promote a Republican majority in the House, a Republican majority that is now incoming and that we should all be clear will be dominated by the voices that are the loudest, the most dangerous, some of the most anti-Semitic, right? Kevin McCarthy may or may not get the gavel, but Marjorie Taylor Greene will be running the show in this House. And we should be really clear that the folks who were pushing to shape the character of the Democratic Party in the primary did not raise a finger to help, and in some cases actually made it harder for us to hold that majority in the general.
So, Ruth, we spoke about, you've had an incredible and distinguished career in the Jewish community on so many issues. Israel and pro-Israel politics is not the area you've typically focused on, but in August, you co-authored a piece in The Nation in which you strongly criticized AIPAC's actions, and you wrote that, quote, "It has been outrageous to see some of the most politically engaged Jewish Americans, including AIPAC and its allies, taking steps that effectively weaken our democracy by engaging in unlimited spending to overwhelm unaligned candidates, supporting candidates who are opposed to democratic laws and norms, and seeking to limit free speech if it is critical of Israel." So I wanted to ask, why are these actions and endorsements by AIPAC and their allies so concerning to you, and why did you decide it was important to speak out publicly about them?
Okay, so thank you. I want to say before I answer your question, first of all, I want to just do a shout out to the ongoing work of Indivisible, which I think has been extraordinary in reminding us that democracy and democratic values are at the lowest level and bubble up, and that's where we make change. And then I want to do a great shout out to J Street and to everybody here who worked in these elections and worked for the advance of democracy, which is, of course, part of the answer to your question. But I also want to just say, Ben did a fantastic job in Wisconsin, and he did a great job of reminding you about the April election. But there's an election on Tuesday, and it is possible to sign on tonight and make calls to voters in Georgia, and you should do it. I spent more hours on the phone. Anyway, but I think really the answer to your question, Logan, is in the question. What I care, in some way, I've discovered through a lot of different wonderful pieces of my career in the Jewish community, out of the Jewish community, that what I care about most fundamentally is social justice and democracy. And so the issue here was, I love J Street, but the issue here was that AIPAC was clearly doing things. And I want to say they have a right to support whatever candidates they want, but the choices that they were making, I saw as subverting democracy, subverting democratic values, using the power of money, which is what Leah just talked about, to make it impossible for grassroots efforts to succeed, and doing that in the name of AIPAC. And that was incredibly distressing to me, so I decided to get involved. And my co-author is Mick Moore, whom many of you know, but who was, it was his initiative that said we should do this piece.
So Leah, you just spoke a little bit about, that this wasn't just AIPAC. I mean, it's part of a broader story of really aggressive outside spending, but I think the common theme is spending in Democratic primaries and on elections by groups that don't necessarily have any either large D or small d Democratic goals and priorities at heart. You mentioned crypto. I think the second biggest spender after United Democracy Project was the crypto, now former billionaire, Sam Bankman-Fried, who spent very aggressively before his fortune evaporated and he faced investigation. But this is not going away, right? We're going to continue to see this kind of spending, presumably from AIPAC and other groups. They want to drive a particular agenda, and it's not that small d Democratic agenda. So how do you think that Democratic leaders and groups in the pro-liberal democracy camp should be responding to all this outside spending going forward, when that spending does seem to be unaligned with the goals that we all share, including the goal of sort of winning elections in November?
Well, I think we all have to recognize primaries as a strategic lever, which is something that is hard for folks who are, we're thinking about not only the primary, but also the general. How do we use resources in the primary? How do we use them in the general? You have to make tough choices about allocation, all of that. But we have to realize that these primaries are really important in terms of shaping the character of the Democratic Party going forward, right? Even before this massive influx of cash, there was already a challenge where, folks, in order to become competitive for some of these places, It helped to have, the ability to write yourself a check for a couple $100,000, and that means that you're going to get more folks who own 10 used car dealerships, and fewer folks who are teachers or union organizers, the kinds of people who would actually be an investment in the brand of the Democratic Party, an investment in like the ambassador for the Democratic Party for decades going forward. Because that's the other thing. These are investments often in safe seats. If you get elected, unless you do something really, really wacky, you're probably going to stay in office as long as you want. And so this is about not just the next year and the next Congress, but it's about 10 years from now. It's about who is going to be competitive as a Senate or gubernatorial candidate in the future. So it's really, I think the other side has recognized very early that this was a really important tool that they needed to put a significant amount of resourcing into. But the other thing, longer term, is that I think the Democratic Party has to get a handle on this, right? Because one, we don't want an arms race in the primaries going on. We do want to put those resources into the general election. And also, it's not helpful to have dark money forces, determining the outcomes in these primaries in ways that are counter to the Democratic Party interests. There was a resolution that came up at the DNC earlier about limiting expenditures by outside groups or creating some restrictions on expenditures by outside groups this summer. It did not pass, but there really could be, concerted action, and we could be moving forward collectively to say, this is simply not the way that we're going to choose our next class of leaders.
I want to add to everything that Leah said before you ask another question, just to remind again that the point that Ben was making. We're focused here, as we should, and as we all pay a lot of attention to Congress and what's shaping Congress now and for the future. But this is, on the part of the people that we're working against, going all the way down to every local state race. And it really becomes important to understand you can't do all 50 states, but you can learn about down ballot races. You can look at we actually did okay in November, but at the successes of affirmative Democratic, small d Democratic secretaries of state, as opposed to the fierce push in many states to elect people who will pursue the effort to deny people their voting rights.
So, one thing I wanted to ask is, you look at this cycle overall, and we see a prominent group like AIPAC, on the one hand, standing with and endorsing folks like Jim Jordan and Scott Perry and Elise Stefanik, and on and on and on, these sort of people who are spouting white nationalist rhetoric, great replacement theory in some cases, certainly the big lie about the 2020 election. And then we see them, on the other hand, spending tens of billions of dollars targeting, fairly mainstream progressive Democrats, folks like Andy Levin, but also a lot of leaders of color in a lot of these races. You mentioned Summer Lee, you mentioned Donna Edwards. I just wonder, what do we think? What is the overall impact of sort of the message that is sending? When we sort of see, on the one hand, saying, well, our friends are these far right bigots, and on the other hand, targeting folks. In many cases, it's hard to really see why, but disproportionately targeting people who come from other communities, from vulnerable minority communities.
Well, come from other communities, vulnerable minorities, and it's a check mark for American democracy that people from some of these marginalized communities are making the serious effort to enter elected office, which I, needless to say, feel very strongly about, and really trying to advance. And we're trying to look for the broadest possible spectrum of, again, people espousing democratic values who get elected to office. So when it appears, as it did in this election, that the AIPAC money, first of all, was going to this large number of Republicans who had literally just supported the January 6th movement, and then was around the country in races just somehow, that's the way they would say it, but targeting people of color. The Donna Edwards, Summer Lee, Congresswoman Summer Lee, yes. But the question, every place that Summer Lee has, every email she's sent, every place I've heard her speak, she says very quietly, I won against a very large sum of dark money, Republican money. And what we're saying here is, yes, but what is the image that sends about dark money, about Republicans, and about AIPAC? Because AIPAC, as a Jewish organization, I want them, which is really the thrust of this piece, to recognize the strong connection that Jamie made last night, but between democracy and Judaism. We are a people who have been protected by democracies throughout history, and we need to stand for and advance, protect, let's say first, protect and advance and enhance the strength of democracy in this country. And when it constantly seems that we're not, and that an organization is putting down people of color and advancing people who have spoken out against fair democratic elections, that sends an incredibly dangerous message.
Yeah, I would also add, this is also about kind of where is the mainstream of American Jews, right? And what interests are being represented by an organization coming in and spending a ton of money for candidates who are anti-choice, for candidates who are election deniers, or for candidates who are election deniers, or to tip the House to candidates who are election deniers. I think one of the things that we really appreciate about J Street is this move to say we are in favor of democracy, right? Like we're actually, as part of our interests, as part of our values, we're promoting democracy here in this country. And that is so crucial and so important because in this moment, that is what the mainstream of American Jews are looking for in leadership. We are, in a moment when there's just enormous anti-Semitism rising, particularly driven by right-wing political and media figures, you have to be really realistic about who is actually representing and promoting the kind of leadership that will stand against anti-Semitism in all of its forms.
Yeah, and I should say on that note, so I think we've mentioned it maybe a bit at the conference already, but J Street recently did our election night polling of Jewish Americans, and we polled Jewish Americans and asked if they approved of what AIPAC did in terms of endorsing candidates who voted against the certification of the election on January 6th, but who say that they're pro-Israel, and 72% of Jewish Americans said, no, we disapprove of that action. So we do have, in fact, the numbers to show that this just simply is not representative of where the community
and
is.
It's critical that J Street did that work and then came up with that evidence. But what I want to say to everybody here is which I know everyone knows, but democracy is not a spectator sport. And it requires endless ongoing activity and commitment. And we want to believe, and I do believe, that J Street, in addition to advancing its extraordinary positions on Mideast politics, cares about all of these other things. But I want to say to each of us, we have essentially a voter responsibility. And that is to know where the candidates that we choose to invest in and that we choose to vote for stand on a range of issues. And accepting, pick your progressive cause, accepting the word of X, I'll say Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood will tell me exactly which candidates in any race are the most strongly protective of a woman's right to choose. But I need to know where those candidates stand on other issues that matter to me, or I become myself a kind of one-issue person. So it requires homework. It requires serious investigation. And the most exciting thing about J Street is that it's made this broad commitment to endorse and enhance small candidates who care about small d democratic values in a country in which they are astoundingly under threat.
So we're going to wrap this panel in a moment, but just to maybe end on a high note, we've talked about some of the impact of AIPAC and UDP's spending in this cycle, but we also talked about the ways that groups like J Street and Indivisible and a lot of others pushed back. And Leah, I'm wondering, as you look towards the next Congress and look at some of the new voices and faces who are coming in, how excited are you about where we shook out and what sort of the future of the Democratic caucus looks like? Are there people that you're particularly excited about seeing in the next Congress? And how are you feeling in terms of the overall effort? And are we going to have good, strong, sort of pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy champions going forward?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say I want to emphasize while this kind of sum of money was significant.